Hello Archo, so today's lesson is on rounding. So our objective today is to be able to round to the nearest tens, hundreds and thousands. So some of you may be wondering why we actually need this. It's really useful and applicable in real life, for example if you go shopping or if you get involved in banking and converting between currencies and stuff like that. And the keywords for today are place value and decimals, in case we see some decimals. Okay, so I'm going to go through some examples and then you may have a go at some yourself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the column. So we have units and then we have tens. Do a little dotted line between the tens and the units. We are rounding to the nearest tens, so we're going to have a look at the column on the right hand side of the tens column, which is the units column. So have a look at that 7. So how we round is we look at the number in the units column. If it is a 5 and above, we're going to round the 6 up to a 7. If it is a 4 and below, that 6 is going to remain as a 6. We do not round down to 5. We just leave the number in the tens column as it is. So that 7 is a 5 and above. So I'm going to round the 6 up in the 10 columns up to a 7, and that becomes 70. Let's have a go at the next one. We have units, tens, hundreds. Have a look at the units column. Is that a 5 and above? No, it's not. Is it a 4 and below? Yes, that 2 is a 4 and below. So we're going to round the 4 here. We're going to round this 4 up to a 5. And that becomes 350. Okay, the next one. We have units, tens, hundreds. We have a look at the column next to the tens, which is the units column, because we are rounding to the nearest 10. Is that a 5 and above? Yes, it is. So we're going to round that 7 up to an 8. And that becomes 480. Don't forget, you should see a similar pattern here, is once we round up or round down, the column which we are rounding, the one next to it, becomes a 0. So if we're rounding tens, the units column becomes 0. If we round tens here, the units column will become a 0. If we round tens here, the units column becomes a 0. Units, tens, hundreds and thousands. So again, we're rounding to the nearest 10. So I'm just going to dot a line here. Have a look at that 8. Is that a 4 and below? No, it's not. Is that a 5 and above? Yes, it is. So the tens column, this one here, we are going to round that up to 10. However, we cannot have 10 tens. What we do is we carry the 10 into this column here, and that becomes 1100. Don't forget this one here, the 9 becomes a 0 and the 8 will also become a 0. Okay, what I'd like you to now do is to pause the video and have a go at the you-dos on the right hand side, and once you're finished, return and I will complete them myself. Okay, welcome back. So on the right hand side, 34. The units column is a 4, that is 4 and below, so that becomes a 30. Don't forget the units column turns into a 0. Next we have units, tens and hundreds. This 4 here is a 4 and below, so the 7 is going to round down, but it's going to remain the same as a 7. Don't forget, we do not round down to a 6, and the units column will become a 0, so that becomes 270. So 476, units, tens, hundreds, that is a 5 and above. So that 7, this one here, will turn into an 8, and the units will go to 0. So that becomes 480. And last but not least, we have units, tens, hundreds and thousands. So we want to round this one. Have a look at the units column. Is that a 5 and above? Yes, it is. So the 2 in the tens column will round up to a 3, and then the units column will turn into a 0. So that becomes 1030. Okay, now we are rounding to the nearest 100. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the correct columns here. So we have the units, tens and hundreds. So again, if we're rounding the hundreds, we're going to look at the column next to the hundreds, and that is the tens. So in the tens column, if this is a 5 and above, the 3 will round up to a 4. However, if it is a 4 and below, the 3 will round down or remain the same as 3. So because that 4 is 4 and below, the 3 is going to round down to a, or will stay the same as a 3. And the tens and the units columns will both turn into 0. that becomes 300. Okay, next we have the units, the tens and the hundreds. We're going to do our dotted line here. Okay, have a look at the tens column, the column on the right hand side of the hundreds column. Remember, we are rounding to the nearest hundreds. We're going to have a look at the column on the right hand side of the hundreds. If that is a 5 and above, the 7 is going to round up to an 8. Is that a 5 and above? Yes, the tens is a 5 and above. So the 7 will round up to an 8, and the remaining values will turn to 0. So that becomes 800. Okay, next, the units, tens, hundreds. Is this 7 a 5 and above? Yes, it is. So the 8 will turn into a 9. We'll round up to a 9. And the remaining values, the placeholders, will turn into a 0. So that becomes 900. Okay, and the final one. We have units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. So remember, we're rounding to the nearest hundred. So we're going to do a line between the 100 and the tens. So what we want to do is, we want to look at the tens column. Is that a 5 and above? No, it's not, so we are not rounding up. Is it a 4 and below? Yes, it is. It's a 3, so it is 4 and below. We're going to round down. So the 7 will round down and remain the same as a 7. And the rest of the values on the right hand side will turn into a 0. So that becomes 1700. What I would like you to do is to pause the video, have a go at the you do section, and come back and I'll go through the answers myself. Okay, welcome back. So on the right hand side, rounding to the nearest hundreds, we have 200, we have 300, we have 500, and we have 2300. Those are our answers there for rounding. Okay, now we're going to be rounding to the nearest thousand. So let's write our columns, units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. So we're rounding to the nearest thousand, so we're going to do a column, a dotted line between the thousand and the hundreds. So we're using the same principle as before. If it is a 4 and below, we will leave the number as it is, and if it is a 5 and above, we will round up. So have a look at this number here, that 4. That is a 4 and below, so the 3 is going to remain the same, and the rest of these numbers here are going to turn into a 0, and that becomes 3000. Okay, let's apply the same principles here. Units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. We do our dotted line between the thousands and the hundreds because we are rounding to the nearest thousand. Then we look at the hundreds column. Is that a 4 and below? No, it's not. Is it a 5 and above? Yes, it is. So we are going to round this 7 up to an 8, and the remaining values will turn into a 0. So that becomes 8,000. Okay, next we have units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. Again, same principle. Is that a 5 and above? Yes, it is. So that 8 will round up to a 9, and the remaining values will turn into 0. That becomes 9,000. And the last one that has the same working will be 2,000. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video, have a go at the you do section, and return. Once you come back, I'll go through the answers myself. Okay, welcome back. So rounding to the nearest thousand. We're going to do a line here between the thousand and the hundreds column. That 3, is it a 4 and below? Yes, it is. So that 2 will remain the same, and the remaining values here will turn into zeros. So they'll carry placeholders. So that becomes a 2,000. The next one will be 3,000, 5,000, and also 5,000. Remember, for the last one, that 3 is a 4 and below, so the 5 will remain the same. It will not round up, it will remain the same. And the remaining values will turn into a 0. Okay, we have come on to the main task now. If you are on set 4 and set 5, I would like you to have a go at all of this task. And what this task means is to, for each of these values here on the left hand side, these ones here, You need to round them to the nearest 1,000, the nearest 100, and the nearest 10. You put your answers in these boxes here, all of these boxes here. Once you have finished it and filled it out as a grid, I'd like you to take a picture and upload it onto ClassCharts. If you have any issues, please message a member of staff on ClassCharts. Good luck.